Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends. And yes, as always, I see a few enemies in the mix. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And you're tuned in to the Dr. Muhammad Files, where we unpack the real issues related to the FBA community with scholarship, civility, and the unapologetic truth. Welcome to the last and final episode 7 of our 7-part series. Today, we wrap up this commentary on Dr. Feagin's powerful book, How Blacks Built America: Labor, Culture, Freedom, and Democracy. So, chapter 7 of Dr. Feagin's essential work is entitled Black Contemporary Global Impacts: Freedom, Justice, and Democracy. In this final chapter, we explore how foundational Black Americans and our organizations contribute and continue to lead the charge in what may be the United States' most critical and enduring struggle. That is, the fight to realize true freedom, justice, and democracy for all, not just the dominant society. FBA influence reaches far beyond national borders, shaping global conversations around equality and human rights. Modern Black counterframing challenges the very foundations of racial hierarchy. It rejects the myths of inferiority and superiority, offering instead a vision rooted in truth, dignity, and justice. These ideals are passed down not only through institutions, but through the everyday spaces of family, friendships, and community, where culture is preserved and resistance is born in the FBA community. One of the most profound contributions of foundational Black Americans is our ability to name, analyze, and call out systemic anti Black racism with clarity and courage. Foundational Black Americans' insights have helped expose the structures of anti Black racism that sustain inequality and have inspired generations to imagine and demand something better. Young foundational Black Americans, like those before us, continue to navigate a world where anti Black racism, both subtle and overt, is a daily reality. This is our lived experience. FBA resilience and questioning spirit are part of a long tradition of seeking truth and justice. So, to fully confront the reality of white supremacy would mean dismantling the dominant narrative of white moral superiority, a narrative deeply embedded in Americans' very fabric of the identity. So, such a reckoning demands bold and systemic change. And it is precisely this kind of change that foundational Black American thinkers, activists, and scholars like myself have long envisioned and fought for. FBA legacy is not just American, it is global. The struggle for justice here reverberates across borders, inspiring movements and reshaping conversations about democracy and human rights around the world. That's why whenever you see something happen around the world, those groups mimic what foundational Black Americans are doing as far as resistance here in America. So let's get started.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a Black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
All right, FBA family friends, and yes, even you enemies, welcome back. That intro always gets me hype. I think I'm gonna change up the intro though on my next podcast. My son is here, so maybe he can help me out. He's the musical genius of the family. So before we get started, I want to offer a quick note for all our listeners, and I usually do this, especially when I'm specifically talking about some scholars that use the misnomer of African American. Um, Throughout this episode, I'll be referring to the work of Dr. Feagin, as you know, and other scholars, liberal scholars. You'll notice that some of them still use the outdated and inaccurate misnomer of African American. I'll only use that label when quoting them directly. Many of us in the foundational Black American community or Freedmen community have moved beyond that term, choosing instead to identify as foundational Black American, a lineage rooted in the unique history of those whose ancestors built this country from the ground up. And then for legal and historical clarity, we also use the term freedmen to describe our status. So you'll see me using those interchangeably as well as African American when directly quoting Dr. Feagin and the likes. So speaking of identity, my next episode, I'm going to go back a little, and I'm going to talk about define the next episode in my podcast will be titled Defining the Foundation. Who are foundational Black Americans? Although I've touched on this in previous episodes, I believe it's time to go deeper. So many people still don't understand why we've buried the term African American and why that shift matters, right? So I'll also be sharing some family photos to show how some of us are Black indigenous to this land, not African in origin, or not just African, I should say, right? Because there was an ethnogenesis. In those pictures, will highlight the ethnogenesis that shaped our people. So foundational Black Americans are not just descendants of enslaved Africans, but Black indigenous were, as you know, sometimes Black indigenous were reclassified, oftentimes, I should say, or most times, Black indigenous were reclassified as Negroes and enslaved with Africans who were kidnapped and brought here, but rather we are a unique amalgamation of indigenous Black people, red native communities, European, the slave master, of course, um, raped, enslaved, melanated immigrants, whether they were African or Black indigenous, and we mix with the Africans. There's no doubt about that. Some of us, not all, I might add, some of us mix with the Africans. I believe that in my family tree, we did mix with some Africans. So we are not just solely African. We're not solely native or Black indigenous, and we're not definitely not solely European. We are a fusion that created a distinct culture identity born of resistance, survival, and innovation. And I digress. I don't want to get too far gone on that. That's what I'm passionate about. That's what my scholarship is about, delineation, and how that intersects with anti-black racism. So let's get started. Dr. Feagin opens up this chapter with a powerful observation. He says, one is hard pressed to name another group in U.S. history that has more positive impact in pressing this country toward real justice, equality, and democracy than African Americans. There he goes with that misnomer. Yet has at the same time been so negatively demonized in white's racial framing of this society. He then quotes the legendary author Richard Wright, who said, African Americans were the only group in our nation that consistently and passionately raised the question of freedom. This is a service to America and to the world. That's a profound truth, FBA family, friends, and you enemies who are lingering. That's a profound truth. So while European colonizers spread systems of genocidal oppression across the globe, it was the resistance and counter framing of foundational black Americans that forced this country to reckon with its contradictions. As Dr. Feagin writes, repeatedly over this long history of racial oppression, the resistance efforts and authentic freedom counterframing of African Americans have forced white elites to take action that, however hesitantly, put the country on a path to expanded social justice. Feagin, he doesn't hold back here. He writes, from the beginning of the United States, most members of the white elite and rank and file whites have not been committed in practice to the famous liberty and justice framing of the society. He goes on to explain that one of the central motivations behind the American Revolution was the desire among white elites, both northern and southern. Let's put that into perspective, because a lot of times when you hear about slavery and anti-black racism, a lot of especially white scholars, they like to frame racism and slavery with just the South, but that we know is not true. So to protect their economic interest in slavery, they kind of frame that as the South. But Dr. Feagin writes, a central reason for the revolutionary revolt against Britain was the desire in much of the elite, Northern and Southern, to protect their interests in a slavery system central to their economic prosperity and social status. From the 17th century onward, they and other whites also feared African American uprisings and revolts. And finally, Dr. Feagin, he closes this section with a sobering truth. He says, today most whites, and indeed many others, have accepted the mythological framing of this society as colorblind, meritocratic, meritocratic, and post-racial. The associated myth of white innocence in regard to past and current racial inequalities has regularly appeared in public discussions and decisions, including those of the United States Supreme Court. Many whites, including conservatives on that court, have viewed even modest remedial programs designed to redress some effects of past and present discrimination as harming whites whom they consider to be largely blameless. So these passages from Dr. Feagin, it lays bare the deep contradictions at the heart of American history, right? While foundational black Americans have been the moral compass of the nation, consistently, consistently pushing it toward its highest ideals of liberty and justice. Because you got to remember, too, uh, FBA family, friends, and enemies, the so-called founding forefathers, they preached of liberty and justice, right? But having enslaved foundational Black Americans in their possessions. They they have also been the most vilified, misrepresented, and resisted. FBA struggle has never been just about inclusion. It's been about transformation, right? The myth of a colorblind post-racial America continues to obscure the reality of anti-black racism and systemic inequality. That's why whenever I hear the word, "Oh, we're living in a colorblind society," or "I don't see color," I always cringe, right? The resistance to even modest reforms reveals just how entrenched white innocence and denial remain. And a lot of people, not all, right? We're not giving a blanket statement here, but a lot of people in the dominant society, they would rather you just forget about slavery. You don't hear them saying this about the Holocaust. You don't you, Can you imagine them telling a Jewish person, "Shut up and get over the Holocaust"? Yet, despite centuries of opposition, foundational Black Americans have never stopped fighting. Our counterframing, that is, foundational Black Americans counterframing, our truth telling, and our vision for a just society continues to challenge the nation, even to this day, and the world to live up to its promise. Now, let's turn our attention to the next section, entitled "Continuing Battles Against Systemic Racism," where Dr. Joe Feagin, he reminds us that the struggle for racial justice in America is far from over for FBAs, or foundational Black Americans. He writes, "Today, African Americans lead the overt battles against systemic racism, including that manifested in this government backtracking. While the 1960s civil rights and Black Power movements have not been followed by similarly numerous protest movements in more recent decades, Black communities have continued to be major generators of progressive efforts and organizations." This observation, FBA family, friends, and you enemies, this observation is both sobering and empowering at the same time, right? Because it acknowledges the reality that systemic anti Black racism, specifically toward foundational Black Americans, has not disappeared. It has simply evolved. It looks different. There's no longer white people with white sheets on horseback riding around burning crosses. That's not how anti-black racism looked. And a lot of people in the dominant society say, "Oh, there's no more racism because there's no more Klan. There's no more people riding around in horseback with white sheets on." But the government backtracking, whether through voter suppression laws, cuts to social programs, or the rollback of affirmative action, which I might add did not benefit foundational Black Americans, affirmative action or for other groups, but it continues to disproportionately affect foundational Black American communities in the aspect of not getting reparations. Right? It was Affirmative action was initially supposed to be a form of reparative justice for foundational Black Americans, but like all other initiatives that the liberals set aside for foundational Black Americans, they don't really set them aside for foundational Black Americans. They give the illusion that they're going to set them aside for foundational Black Americans, but what happens is they end up allocating all those resources and funds to other groups like African Caribbeans, immigrant Latinos, white immigrant Latinos, Asians, and other groups, not foundational Black Americans. Yet, despite these setbacks, foundational Black Americans remain at the forefront of resistance, innovation, and advocacy. In fact, foundational Black Americans have always been the main ones on the forefront against global white supremacy. You won't find another group, don't take my word for it, Go do some research. You will never find another group who has consistently fought global white supremacy than foundational black Americans. We see this leadership not only in grassroots movements, but also in cultural, academic, and political spaces. From the rise of the unification of foundational black Americans and our delineation to the Nation of Islam in their work fighting for housing justice, education equality, and police accountability, the legacy of resistance is alive and well. These efforts may not always make national headlines, but they are the heartbeat of our resistance. Dr. Feagin continues. Since the 1960s, there have been periodic large scale demonstrations against particular types of racial discrimination in numerous black communities. For instance, frequent local protests have targeted the recurring incidents of anti black violence involving white police officers. For example, in the 2009 protest, excuse me, excuse me, in Oakland, California, the 2014 protest in Ferguson, Missouri, the 2014 protests in New York City, and similarly 2014-2015 protests in nearly 200 cities across the country over the continued killing of unarmed black men by white police officers. And this is a continuing issue. Even there are incidents where there are young black men being hung, but are it's being classified as suicide. This is a problem, and that the media, especially the white media, and of course the racist right, will never pick this up. These are issues that we know in the foundational Black American community are happening. But these protests weren't just reactions; they were declarations, right? Declarations that the delineation of foundational Black Americans and the recognition of our lineage as a unique one matters. And once we can highlight that there are people in America that continues to have anti-foundational black Americans, including xenophobia from immigrants, and that justice must be served, and that the silence is complicity, especially by the liberal uh, Democratic Party, right? They know that there is a push to have immigrants come here and replace us. I'm just going to put it out there. They know this and they are the perpetrators of it. The names of people like Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and so many others became rallying cries for generations demanding change. And while the scale of these demonstrations may ebb and flow, the spirit of resistance remains constant. So, what Dr. Feagin captures so powerfully is the enduring role of black communities as moral leaders in the fight for justice. We have always been on the forefront as the moral leaders of justice. Again, our courage, creativity, and confinement continue to shape the consistence of the nation. Let's now turn to a vital theme in Dr. Joe Feagin's How Blacks Built America, the Enduring Resistance to Racism, both individually and collectively. This section, titled Fighting Racism, Individual and Group Resistance, it looks at and explores how foundational black Americans have historically and contemporarily responded to systemic oppression and anti black racism, not just with survival, but with strategic defiance and cultural resilience. Dr. Feagin, he writes, facing James Crow Esquire, discrimination in contemporary society, the majority of African Americans as individuals and in family or other groups honed the centuries old black counterframe for dealing with present day racism. This anti racist frame encompasses a strong critique of white oppression and its everyday operation, as well as intensive countering of negative framing of African Americans, and an empathetic accent on creating real social justice. This anti-oppression counterframe typically draw on a traditional home cultural frame that African Americans have also developed since the first century of enslavement. They have maintained a substantial home culture with important features stemming from their African backgrounds and aspects imported from the dominant culture, all shaped significantly by their adaptation to the U.S. settings of racial oppression. So if they have African culture mixed with the dominant culture, mixed with the natives, then that's called an ethnogenesis. But again, while Dr. Feagin uses the term African Americans, it's essential to clarify we are foundational black Americans, the descendants of those who were enslaved and built this country from the ground up. Our counterframe is not borrowed or inherited from elsewhere. It is uniquely American, black American, forged in the crucible of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and ongoing systemic anti black racism. It is a worldview rooted in truth telling, resistance, and the pursuit of justice. So Dr. Feagin continues by examining how these resistance is passed down generationally, particularly through the socialization of foundational black American children. He says, parents and other socializers of black children typically fit teachings about discrimination to a child's capacities, age, and gender. Thus, given the especially aggressive white targeting of black males for everyday discrimination, they often provide stronger lessons about being cautious around white authorities, such as police officers, for sons than for daughters. In contrast, girls are frequently taught a somewhat different array of strategies, some gendered for dealing with other aspects of white racism. In one research study, a savvy college student explained her intergenerational socialization and counterframing. Um, Thus, my parents, she says, this is the participant in the study. My parents tried to tell me one thing. They tried to instill in me that I was a beautiful person, that my blackness was a beautiful thing, that the fact that I braided my hair was fine. But when you're like 9, 10, 11, you tend to not listen to your parents and you tend to listen to everything else, which is white people. In my case, white people. So this quote, it captures the tension between parental affirmation and societal negation. Even as foundational black American parents strive to instill pride, right? We always hear the FBA parents talking about wear the crown, the natural hair. Or I shouldn't say all, but some. Um, the dominant culture often works to undermine these messages. The college student reflection reveals the psychological warfare our children face. We all know about the study done back in the 60s, and I think it was a current study done in the 2000s, I believe, where white psychologists gave the white dolls to the black children and white and black dolls and asked them which one were pretty. We all know that they pick the white baby as being more pretty because of cultural conditioning, right? So the values, the psychological warfare our children face, where white norms and values attempt to override the truth of the beauty, the brilliance, and the heritage, is a constant struggle. Feagin concludes this section with he concludes it with a critique of the prevailing white narrative that America has moved beyond race, right? So he says, currently, much white framing of the United States assents the erroneous notion that this is a post racial society in which black Americans already have rough equality with whites. From this perspective, government remedial action is not necessary. He goes on to quote, a Gallup poll found that though a significant majority of black respondents still saw a major need for government action to improve black socioeconomic conditions, a very small percentage of whites felt the same. So this post-racial myth is not just false and a fallacy, It's a deliberate erasure of the lived realities of foundational Black Americans. So, and you hear this all the time, and I hear people, when I get into conversations about race with people, oh, we're such a melting pot, we're so post racial, and as if I'm not standing there, and as if my experience, my lived realities don't matter, and I should shut up and not share my lived experience. It ignores the wealth gap, the policing disparities, the educational inequalities, and the historical theft of labor and land. As a scholar and a foundational Black Americans on both sides of my lineage, I reject this framing entirely. The only government action I would assert that is just and necessary is the payment of the debt owed to us. That is lineage based reparations delivered through direct cash payments to the descendants of freedmen. I can buy my own land. I can buy my own education, or at least pay off my debts, right? Anything less is a continuation of the injustice Dr. Feagin so clearly documents. So, coming off our last segment, fighting racism, individual and group resistance, we now turn to a critical extension of that resistance, the intellectual and activist work of foundational Black Americans who have long been at the forefront of analyzing and challenging systemic anti-Black racism. So the next section is entitled "Scholar, Activist, Realistic Analysis for Building Real Democracy." It highlights how truth-telling and rigorous scholarship have been essential tools in the fight for justice. Dr. Joe Feagin writes, one of the great contributions that African Americans have made to this society are many incisive, realistic, and honest analysis of systemic racism. The previous accounts fully demonstrate how such analysis is critical to successfully fighting everyday racism. As black demonstrators said during the 1960s freedom movements, it is necessary to tell it like it is. In recent decades, as in the distant past, African American scholars and activists have been on the cutting edge of research and public analysis of systemic racism, including how to change it. Let me pause here to say this. If you haven't noticed, I am deeply passionate about fighting anti black racism, anti foundational black American racism specifically, because uh, now that we have an influx of African and Caribbeans, we have to specify and delineate because a lot of them say, oh, there's no racism until they're being targeted for uh, deportation. Then they say, oh, racism, and we say, oh, we told you. Anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. So this isn't just academic for me. It's personal, political, and ancestral, right? One of the driving forces behind my research is the delineation of foundational black Americans. I believe that this is a necessary distinction that has emerged from lived experience. So over time, we, that being in the foundational black American community, we begin to notice a troubling pattern, right? Individuals with melanated skin, whom we initially assumed were foundational black Americans, were actively undermining our efforts. So we started to look and say, hey, well, wait a minute, who is that? Who was there? So upon closer examination, we discovered that many were immigrants, often speaking on foundational black Americans' behalf, that shaping our narratives and occupying spaces meant for us without shaping our lineage or historical experiences. And this is important. This is why it's important to delineate. For example, look at the Congressional Black Caucus. We call them, well, some people call them the Congressional uh, Black Coons, right? Um, I won't go there, but I understand their sentiment. It's made up of all immigrants who have melanated skin, but do nothing to uplift the foundational black American community or fight for our interests. We have to run candidates who are foundational Black Americans and who will specifically fight for our interests. This realization led me to develop a research framework centered on ethnomelanism, a lens that examines how shared skin tone is actually weaponized to obscure lineage and erase the unique historical and cultural identity of foundational Black Americans. And I talked about ethnomelanism in one of my previous podcasts, one of my first podcasts, actually. So go back and check it out. I give a more in-depth detail of ethnomelanism. So my work, it also interrogates how anti-Black American racism, anti-Black misandry, and FBA erasure intersect within institutions like higher education, particularly in recruitment and tenure process. This is what my research centers on. So these systems often elevate, and I show this in my research, non-FBA voices like African and Caribbeans, while marginalizing those of us who are direct descendants of the enslaved people who actually built this country. So Dr. Feagin continues, contemporary African American intellectuals and scholar activists have contributed numerous other critical analytical tools necessary to better understand and change the highly racist society. This is precisely, FBA family, friends, and you enemies who are still listening, this is precisely why my research matters. To confront anti foundational Black American racism, we must understand its nuances. It's not just about overt discrimination, it's about how both the political right and left perpetuate anti blackness. I'll say that again. It's about how both the political right and the left perpetuate anti black racism. Both parties are complicit in our benign neglect and anti black racism. The right may be more explicit, but the left has long used immigrants with melanated skin to dilute and redirect our struggle. For example, with reparations. So, for decades, white liberals have told us, they told us to look to Africa for our cultural connection. Look over there, you Africans. But let me be clear, my family hasn't been to Africa in over 500 years. Our roots are here. Our blood, sweat, and tears are in the soil of this nation. We are not visitors or immigrants. We are the architects. In fact, we are the only, I'll say that again. We are the only non immigrants in America. This is our country. We built the United States of America, and we will not be erased, replaced, or misrepresented. Scholar activism, especially from an FBA perspective, it's not just about critique, right? It's about reclamation. It's about telling the truth, building frameworks that reflect our lived reality, and demanding reparative justice that is lineage based, not color coded. So, FBA family, friends, and enemies, in conclusion, Dr. Feagin, he concludes his book with a powerful reflection. He says, for centuries, African American activists and intellectuals have insisted on a broad collective view of this society, including an emphasis on genuine liberty and justice for all. I assert, we, foundational Black Americans, pushed America toward democracy. For example, and I mentioned this earlier, when the so called founding fathers declared liberty and justice for all, Black individuals were enslaved. How can you say liberty and justice for all when Black people were enslaved? That phrase was never meant to include foundational Black Americans. But through centuries of resistance, sacrifice, and scholarship, foundational Black Americans forced this nation to confront its contradictions. We are the moral background of American democracy. Dr. Feagin, he closes with the sobering words of constitutional scholar Derek Bell. Dr. Bell is credited with one of the first architects of critical race theory. He says, Constitutional scholar Derek Bell argued that the liberal ideal of thorough racial integration has turned out to be a pipe dream for most whites have been unwilling to allow such major societal transformation. No living American is likely to see comprehensive racial integration and meaningful social justice for all. In Bell's admittedly pessimistic view, however, African Americans and by implication others truly committed to social justice must nonetheless continue their active struggles against white racism to keep gains from being rolled back, even while they maintain a hard nosed racial realism about continuing white oppression. Bell insists that we must realize our forebears that struggle for freedom is at the bottom a manifestation of our humanity that survives and grows stronger through resistance to oppression, even if that oppression is never overcome. So FBA family and friends, this is the heart of our fight. Racial realism doesn't mean giving up. It means seeing clearly. It means resisting with full awareness of the forces against us while never surrendering our humanity. How blacks built America is more than a historical account. It's a blueprint for truth, resistance, and transformation. As a scholar, freedom fighter, and a proud foundational black American, I will continue to fight on that legacy. So, FBA family and friends, I hope you enjoyed the commentary of this 7-part series on Dr. Joe Feagin's How Blacks Built America, Labor, Culture, Freedom, and Democracy. So, join us next on our next podcast entitled Defining the Foundation, Who Are Foundational Black Americans. Again, this episode will highlight a section from my dissertation and dive deeper into the importance of lineage, culture, sovereignty, and the political implications of FBA delineation. So, until next time, stay grounded, stay critical, and stay committed. The fight for FBA recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy they were denied. The future of FBA empowerment is in our hands, and together we will reshape it. So stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the podcast, subscribe, share it, contribute to our nonprofit BAFLA, Black American Freedmen, Future Leaders of America, where we teach leadership skills and um, and we also teach conflict resolution to young youth. And comment below. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.